In 1883, the United States Congress allocated funds for 4 new naval vessels. The allocation wasn't large, about $1.5 million, and 4 new vessels wasn't that many, but the Naval Allocation Act of 1883 was important because it represented the beginning of a new era and sort of a renaissance for the United States Navy. The 4 vessels built were popularly called the A, B, C, D vessels, the protected cruisers USS Atlanta, USS Boston, USS Chicago, and the dispatch ship USS Dolphin. And while each of these innovative vessels would serve with distinction in many ways, one just happened to be central to many of the most important events of the era. The history of the protected cruiser USS Boston is illustrative of the era of U.S. interventionism. It is history that deserves to be remembered. During the U.S. Civil War, the United States built one of the largest and most modern navies in the world. But in the period that followed, the Navy stagnated, going through an era sometimes referred to by historians as the Dark Age of the United States Navy. The fleet lagged behind both in quantity and quality. The U.S. was wary of foreign adventurism, disinterested in foreign wars, and stingy in spending. When they did spend on naval appropriations, the money was poorly monitored, and quite a lot was lost to graft. 2 extraordinary and nearly forgotten events finally brought Congress to realize the value of a modern navy. The conflict called the War of '68 was the first of 3 wars fought over a period of 30 years by Cuban rebels seeking independence from Spain. In fitting with its generally isolationist attitude, the United States maintained a policy of strict neutrality during the 10-year insurrection. However, the U.S. couldn't keep itself entirely free of a conflict so close to its shores. The USS Virginius was a sidewheel steamer that had been built as a blockade runner during the U.S. Civil War. In 1870, the ship had been procured by supporters of the rebellion in Cuba and was being used to deliver men, arms, and supplies to the rebels. There were American financial interests involved, and even though Spain declared the Virginius an outlaw vessel, it was quietly defended by U.S. Navy vessels. In October 1873, the Virginius, carrying arms and ammunition, was captured by the Spanish ship Tornado, which ironically had originally been constructed on behalf of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Declaring the crew to be pirates, because of course all good stories involve pirates, the Spanish sentenced the Virginius's crew, including both American and British citizens, to death. Despite protests by both Great Britain and the United States, 53 crew members were executed, including the ship's captain, an American named Joseph Fry. The executions only stopped when a British warship intervened and threatened naval bombardment. While the Spanish had labeled the Virginius a pirate ship, the U.S. position was that by taking a U.S.-flagged ship on the open sea, it was the Spanish who had committed an act of piracy. When news of the executions reached the nation, there was a growing outcry for outright intervention in the Cuban insurrection, which would have meant war with Spain. But diplomacy prevailed. The U.S. negotiated the return of the ship and a remaining crew and reparations for the families of the Americans who were executed. Great Britain separately negotiated reparations for Spain for the Britons that had been executed, and war was avoided. But the Virginius affair represented a stark reality. Had the U.S. gone to war, its navy was far outclassed by Spain. Navy planners noted that a Spanish ship, the Arapils, happened to be in New York when the affair occurred, and the U.S. Navy did not have a single vessel that could challenge the 3,400-ton armored frigate. In response, the U.S. authorized 5 iron warships, as the nation realized that a modern navy would be needed to defend U.S. interests. In 1879, Chile went to war with an alliance of Bolivia and Peru in what was called the War of the Pacific. Keen to keep the peace to facilitate trade as well as to protect U.S. financial interests in Peru, the U.S. tried to force a quick resolution of the crisis. In brief, the U.S. overtures proved worthless because U.S. threats carried no weight. The U.S. Navy could not match that of Chile, who laughed off U.S. attempts to force an end to the conflict. By 1882, and despite the modernization of fleets throughout the world owing to the Industrial Revolution, the United States did not have a single modern naval vessel. William Hunt was a South Carolina-born, Yale-trained lawyer who was practicing law in New Orleans when the Civil War started. While he served as a colonel in the Confederate Army, he had actually opposed secession. After the war, he was a professor of law, served as an attorney general of Louisiana, and was appointed by President Rutherford B. Hayes to the U.S. Court of Claims. In 1881, President James A. Garfield appointed him Secretary of the Navy. Hunt's tenure was short, just over a year, and was disadvantaged by the fact that the president who appointed him was assassinated just 4 months into his term. Yet Hunt played an important role in his brief time as Secretary of the Navy. He created the Navy Advisory Board, which made a complete study of the U.S. fleet, and in November of 1881 proposed to Congress the radical suggestion that they appropriate $30 million to build 30 modern steel warships. It wasn't difficult to convince Congress that the current fleet was obsolete, but $30 million was just a step too far. Instead, Congress allocated just $1.3 million for just 4 warships. But the ABCD vessels were important. They were the beginning of what has been called the New Navy. Boston was the second of the ABCD ships to be laid down on November 13th, 1883, a week after Atlanta was laid down in the same yard. She was commissioned in May of 1887. Boston was 283 feet long, with a beam of 42 feet and a displacement of 3,189 long tons. Although she included 8 coal-fired boilers, as built, the ship also included full sail rigging in order to extend range and because the Navy did not yet fully trust steam engines. The sails would eventually be removed. While the armor was relatively light, just 2 inches over the guns and 1.5 inches over the machinery spaces, the armor was steel, which had proven much harder and more durable than iron. The ship was armed with guns of multiple sizes, as was naval practice at the time. Different size guns allowed gunners to identify their gun by its splash so that they could correct for targeting. The battery included 2 8-inch, 6 6-inch, 2 6-pounder, and 2 3-pounder guns. The guns were far more modern than the smoothbore, muzzle-loading guns used by most ships of the U.S. Navy at the time. While they were intended to be modern ships, it was occurring during an era when progress was moving very quickly, and so all 4 were really obsolete before they were even commissioned, and all 4 would go through major refits over their service life. Still, all 4 managed distinguished service. Boston, however, happened to be central to a dizzying array of events that represented the dynamism of the era. For example, in October of 1888, the Boston was the first U.S. naval vessel on the scene in a diplomatic crisis in Haiti, where the Haitian Navy confiscated the American steamship Haitian Republic. The Haitian Republic had been confiscated for blockade running, providing supplies to insurgents in Haiti's north, part of a conflict over a contested presidential election. The little-remembered affair, in which the threat of U.S. force compelled the release of the ship, not only showed the contrast in both the capability and the intent of the Navy, which forced a different outcome than the Virginia's affair just 15 years earlier, but also demonstrated the more aggressive U.S. foreign stance, as the nation moved from isolationism to a more imperialist stance. What the New York Times called the Haitian outrage presaged the willingness of the U.S. to intervene in Haiti, which eventually resulted in a near 20-year U.S. military intervention on the island. Boston joined what the Navy called the Squadron of Evolution in 1889. The purpose of the squadron was purportedly to test multi-ship tactics, but the squadron was sent on a tour of the Mediterranean and South America, an expedition clearly intended to demonstrate U.S. naval power and a precursor to the voyage of the Great White Fleet that would take place in 1907. In fact, the squadron was sometimes called the White Squadron. Again, the Boston represented a nation more willing to flex its muscles in a modern world. Those muscles were flexed more strenuously in October of 1893. Boston was in Hawaii when a conspiracy of mostly foreigners concocted a coup d'etat against Queen Liliuokalani of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Marines and sailors of the Boston were sent ashore under the pretext of protecting American civilians. They never fired a shot, but as historian William Russ concluded, their presence made it impossible for the monarchy to protect itself, for fear of a military confrontation. Although remaining technically neutral in the coup, the sailors and Marines of the Boston in essence facilitated the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. While there would be more diplomatic wrangling and a counter-coup attempt in 1895, Liliuokalani never regained her throne, and Hawaii was officially annexed to the United States in 1898. In 1898, the Boston was with the U.S. Asiatic Squadron when the United States declared war on Spain, a continuation of the conflict that had included the Virginia's affair 25 years earlier. Things had changed in those years, and the U.S. fleet far outclassed the Spanish Pacific Squadron, which was defeated in one of the most lopsided naval battles in history in the Battle of Manila. Once again, Boston was at the forefront of the foreign policy of the more confident, more aggressive nation the United States had become. While the Boston was in the Philippines, the Empress Dowager Cixi of China engineered a virtual coup against her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor. Along with other European powers, the U.S. sent warships to China to represent U.S. interests. The actions were intended as threats, although the various nations were as intent on watching each other as they were the Chinese. One of the first ships sent was the Boston. Although there was no foreign intervention at the time, the fear of foreign aggression would lead the Empress to support the Boxer movement 2 years later during the Boxer Rebellion. This resulted in another American foreign adventure and a shifting of power in Asia that would affect world events through the Second World War. Boston was with the Pacific Squadron in 1903 when the Colombian province of Panama declared its independence on November 3rd. Boston was the first ship of the Pacific Squadron to arrive in Panama, ostensibly to protect American interests should fighting ensue. The presence of United States naval vessels on both coasts of Panama had the effect of preventing Colombia from intervening, thus ensuring the success of the movement to separate Panama, which then allowed the United States to acquire from the new republic a treaty for the construction and control of the Panama Canal. In 1907, the United States intervened in a conflict between Nicaragua and Honduras, with the goal, theoretically, of preserving peace, but also to protect U.S. economic interests, both the Panama Canal and the banana trade. The Boston carried the Honduran delegation to the peace conference that ended the war. The U.S. intervention allowed them to dictate terms of the peace, which included an agreement that Honduras would remain neutral in any future Central American wars. The U.S. interest in Honduras, with 8 U.S. interventions between 1903 and 1925, led the writer O. Henry to coin the term Banana Republic, and defined the period where U.S. troops were being deployed almost constantly in conflicts in the Americas, called the Banana Wars. In the study of U.S. history, the period between the U.S. Civil War and the First World War is often neglected, even the Spanish-American War, and yet it was a very important period in American history, a period of rapid growth, of economic development, and of a much more muscular foreign policy. The Naval Appropriations Act of 1883 was intended to give the United States a navy that could compete with its European rivals. The act represented the new confidence of the nation, and the ABCD ships would witness many of the events that would set the stage for the conflicts and U.S. interests through the 20th century. The USS Boston was in the heart of the key events of the period that saw the United States become a player on the global stage. By the U.S. entry into the Great War in 1917, the 30-year-old vessel was far too old to use as a warship, but she still found service. She was demilitarized, her guns were removed, and she was turned into a transport, and the War Shipping Board used her to ship military supplies. She was still afloat, still with the Navy in 1940, when she was renamed Dispatch in order to free the name Boston for a new Baltimore-class heavy cruiser. But she found service during the Second World War, operating as a radio training ship. It wasn't clear until 1946 that she was finally stricken from the naval rolls, towed out to sea outside of San Francisco, and deliberately sunk. She was the last of the ABCD vessels to serve, one of only a small handful to serve in any role through both the Spanish-American War and both World Wars. And her extraordinary 59 years service with the United States Navy saw the nation through one of its most dynamic periods and witnessed some of the most important events of that period. Both of her original 8-inch guns are now on display at Hamlin Park in Shoreline, Washington. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.